She had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, and she was very good at it. But tonight, invisibility would not save her. The bonding ceremony of King Calum Ashvane was the most anticipated event in the Ashvane Pack's history. Every wolf in the 5 territories knew the ritual by heart. At the stroke of the blood moon's zenith, the Alpha King would press his palm to his chosen mates. The ancient magic would rise, and the bond would seal. Simple, sacred, irrevocable. The whole court had watched him select Lady Seraphine of the Ironwood Caldwells 3 months ago. A woman with silver hair and impeccable bloodlines, and a smile that could silence a room. The whole court had prepared their finest dresses and sharpened their finest gossip. The whole court had already decided how tonight would end. No one had consulted Marin. Marin was a record keeper, 3rd tier of the palace staff, which meant she moved through marble corridors with her chin tucked and her ink-stained fingers clasped, and her careful, practiced talent for making herself nothing more than a fixture of the background. She catalogued the treaties, cross-referenced the lineage maps, repaired the crumbling spines of histories that no one else cared to read. She was good at her work, and she asked for nothing, and she had a secret that sat in her chest like a stone she had swallowed. The day she arrived at the palace, heavy, immovable, and absolutely never to be spoken aloud. The secret was this: she was cursed, not in any dramatic, legendary way. There was no prophecy etched in temple stone about her. There was no dark sorcerer who had pointed a trembling finger at her cradle. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse. She had been born in the borderlands between the 1st and 2nd territories, in a village that sat on the seam of old wolf magic, and something in that seam had snagged her. She could feel the mate bond. Feel it the way other wolves described it, that pull in the sternum, that recognition in the blood. But it did not work correctly on her. Every wolf healer she had ever visited in secret had told her the same thing in different words. Your bond thread is damaged, frayed. The magic that should connect you to another person passes through you like water through a cracked vessel. You will always feel the pull, but you will never be able to seal it. You will never complete a bond. This was not, under normal circumstances, a catastrophic problem. Plenty of wolves lived without formal bonding. Plenty chose not to complete the ceremony. Plenty simply loved who they loved and let the magic be. The problem was what she felt every time King Calum Ashvane walked into a room she happened to be in. She had tried to call it something else for 2 years and 8 months. She had tried to call it professional admiration and physical attraction and the natural consequence of proximity to power. She had catalogued every rational explanation in the same methodical way she catalogued the old treaties, cross-referenced, annotated, filed. But the pull in her sternum never filed. It never catalogued. It sat there patient and enormous and entirely unconcerned with her explanations, tethered to a man who did not know she existed, tethered by a thread that, by every healer's account, could never hold. The night of the bonding ceremony, she was supposed to be in the archive wing. She had been assigned to cross-reference the ceremonial lineage documents one final time, before they were sealed into the palace vault after the ritual. Her job was to verify every name on the bonding scroll and confirm it against the territorial registry. She was not supposed to be anywhere near the moon hall. She was not supposed to watch. She was there anyway. She told herself it was because the hall adjoined the archive corridor, and she simply needed to pass through. She told herself she was merely fulfilling the last of her duties in proximity to the ceremony, that she would keep her eyes down and her feet moving. She stood in the carved doorway of the moon hall's outer gallery, where the lesser staff sometimes pressed close to glimpse important rituals, and she looked at the floor, and then she looked up. Calum Ashvane stood at the center of the hall like something the moon had made specifically and carefully. He was tall in the way of old bloodlines, not merely large but assembled, every proportion suggesting function, as though his body had been designed for the specific purpose of bearing the weight of a kingdom. He wore the bonding robes, deep silver gray with the ash vein mark, embroidered at the collar in black thread, and his dark hair was pushed back from his face, and his expression was the one Marin had catalogued across nearly 3 years of careful distance, closed, controlled. The look of a man who had learned to hold himself so still that nothing could get purchase on him. She had seen him angry. She had seen him cold. She had seen him exact and efficient, and occasionally, in unguarded moments near the window of his private study when he thought no one was watching. She had seen something else, some brief softening around the eyes, some almost their quality, as though a warmer version of him was pressing against the inside of a glass and choosing always to stay there. She looked at him from the gallery doorway, and the stone in her chest ached, which was simply what the stone in her chest did, which was simply her life, which was fine. Lady Seraphine stood across from him in ivory and gold, luminous and composed. The court was arranged in formal arcs around the central dais. The blood moon hung heavy and red through the great glass panels of the hall's vaulted ceiling, and the ceremonial officiant, an elder wolf named Sorcha, with white hair braided to her waist, held the binding cloth between her hands and began to speak the old words. Marin made herself watch the floor again. She made herself prepare to leave. She had verified the scroll. Her work was done. There was no reason to stay. The old words continued, and Calum Ashvane extended his hand, palm up, and Lady Seraphine placed her hand in his, and Sorcha began to wind the binding cloth. And the magic did not rise. Not a flicker, not a thread. The moon hall was absolutely silent. Marin's head came up. She was not the only one. Every wolf in the hall had gone still with the specific stillness of animals, encountering something that should not exist. The ceremonial magic of the bonding was older than the palace, older than the territories, older than any law or language they had inherited. It did not fail. It had never failed. It answered when called because it was not a trick or a ritual prop. It was the territory's own deep wolf magic, recognizing a true fated pair and lighting between them like a lamp. It had not lit. Sorcha's hands went still. Lady Seraphine's composed face cracked open around the edges. Calum did not move, but something in his jaw shifted. Some minute tension that Marin, from across the gallery, recognized because she had catalogued every expression he had without meaning to. And then the magic did rise. It rose in the wrong direction. It came from across the hall. It moved like a current of warm water through cold, or like the first thread of gold in a sunrise, slow, certain, entirely unconcerned with the several hundred witnesses who were watching it happen. It passed through the crowd without touching them. It climbed the steps of the gallery. It found the carved doorway where Marin was standing with her ink-stained hands and her tucked chin and her 3 years of carefully practiced invisibility, and it stopped. At her, the stone in her chest was no longer stone. It was light. It was impossible, terrifying, humiliating light, and it pulled toward him, and she felt the thread that every healer had told her was damaged and frayed and broken beyond repair, stretched taut and straight and burning, felt it reach across the entire width of the moon hall and connect. With a click she felt in her spine to Calum Ashvane. Every head in the hall turned. Calum's eyes found her in the doorway. His hand was still extended, palm up, still holding Lady Seraphine's fingers. And he looked at Marin across all that impossible distance, and she watched the closed, controlled expression on his face go entirely away. She ran. It was not a dignified decision. It was purely animal. The deep wolf panic of a creature suddenly and catastrophically exposed. And she turned from the doorway and she ran down the archive corridor, and she did not stop until she had put 3 locked doors and 2 flights of stairs between herself and the moon hall. And then she sat on the cold stone floor of the lowest archive, with her back against the shelves and her hands pressed flat to her sternum, trying to breathe. The thread was still there. It was still pulled taut. She could feel him at the other end of it. Feel him the way you feel the sun on your skin through a window, present and warm and entirely inescapable, And the thread that should have been broken, that had been broken, was whole. She had no explanation for this. She had no healer's annotation that covered this. She pressed harder on her sternum and breathed, and told herself she was wrong. She was mistaken. She had imagined the whole thing from the pressure of being so close to the ceremony, from the proximity to strong pack magic, from 2 years and 8 months of wanting something she had decided she could not have. She almost believed herself. The archive door opened. She was on her feet before she finished thinking about it, ink-stained hands finding the nearest shelf, body turning toward the work table as though she had simply been retrieving a document. But the person in the doorway was not a courtier or a guard, and when she looked up it was Calum Ashvailin alone, still in his bonding robes, and the controlled expression was still gone and had not come back. He looked at her the way the magic had moved toward her, certain, slow, without any apparent concern for the several hundred witnesses they had left behind upstairs. She said, "Your Majesty, I apologize. I should not have been in the gallery. I was completing the lineage verification, and the corridor connects directly to." "I know who you are," he said. She stopped Marin. "Archive 3rd tier. You've been in the palace for 3 years. You cataloged the Greyhaven Treaty Discipi in the 2nd month of your appointment, and corrected an error that had gone unnoticed for 60 years. He was looking at her as though seeing her specifically, not as background or fixture or staff. "I noticed." She had spent 3 years learning to be invisible. She appeared to have failed. He crossed the archive in several unhurried strides and stopped at a distance that was not quite appropriate for a king and a record keeper, but was also not so close that she couldn't breathe. And he looked at her for a moment with that open expression she had never seen on him before, except in fragments through glass. And he said, "Did you feel it?" She opened her mouth to deny it. The thread between them pulled, warm and insistent, directly through her sternum, and the denial did not come out. "Yes," she said instead. He exhaled, a long, slow breath, as though he had been holding it for some time. He looked at his own hand, the one he had been extending to Lady Seraphine, and then back at her. "I need you to know," he said, "that I have no intention of forcing anything, but I also need you to understand what happened up there. Because I have spent 6 months performing the correct courtship of the correct woman selected by my council, and the bond did not rise for her, and then you were standing in that doorway. It should not have risen for me," Marin said. He stopped. "I'm cursed," she said. It came out steadier than she had expected. 3 years of being practiced and quiet apparently applied to catastrophic admissions as well as everything else. "My bond thread is damaged. Every healer I've consulted has told me it cannot seal. Whatever you felt in that hall, it wasn't real. It was a resonance, probably, from being in close proximity to the ceremony's magic. I'm sorry for the disruption to the ritual. I will stay out of the gallery in future." She picked up the nearest document from the work table. She pretended to review it. Her hands were not entirely steady. He was quiet for a long moment, and she could feel him looking at her, the way she had always felt him enter a room. Not the way she felt other people, but specifically, precisely, the way you feel your own heartbeat. "The old magic," he said finally, "doesn't resonate. It recognizes. That is its entire nature." She kept her eyes on the document. "Your Majesty, Calum," he said. She looked up in spite of herself. "My name," he said, "is Calum, and I think that whatever you were told about your bond thread, something tonight suggests the assessment was incomplete." She thought about the thread that had stretched taut and whole across the entire width of the moon hall. She thought about the click in her spine. She thought about the stone in her chest that was now light. She said, "I think you need to return to your ceremony." He did return. She heard, through 3 floors of stone and 2 locked doors, the absolute lack of any announcement from the moon hall over the next hour, which meant the ceremony had not been completed and the bonding had not been sealed. Lady Seraphine was escorted to her chambers by the Caldwell family retinue. The court dispersed in murmuring knots of confusion and speculation. The blood moon completed its arc and began to descend. In the lowest archive, Marin sat at the work table and did not read any documents, and held her hand over her sternum and felt the thread, steady and warm and impossible, for the first time in her life. She thought, "This cannot end well," she thought. "I know exactly how it ends." She thought, "I should have stayed in the archive corridor." And then, because she was a woman who had spent a long time learning to be precise in her assessments, she also thought, but something tonight suggests the assessment was incomplete. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the archive and she waited for the thread to fade, because it would fade. It always eventually dissipated when she had been too near strong pack magic, and in the morning she would review the healer's reports she had collected in a locked box under her cot and remind herself of the facts, and she would be fine. The thread did not fade. By dawn, it was exactly as bright and steady and warm as it had been when it clicked into place at the doorway of the moon hall. And Marin was sitting at the work table in the same position she had been in all night. And she was starting to consider the possibility that one or more of her foundational assumptions about herself was wrong. The next 4 days were extraordinary in their difficulty. The palace was alive with speculation the way a wound is alive with inflammation. Constant, heat-generating, impossible to ignore. The court talked of nothing but the failed ceremony. The Caldwell family issued a formal statement through their representative, expressing their confidence in Lady Seraphine's suitability and their expectation that the ceremony would be rescheduled. Lord Caldwell himself was seen in conference with 3 of the council's most senior members, and the word that filtered down through the staff hierarchy was the word investigation. Into the magic's failure, into the disruption, into whatever had happened in the gallery doorway, into Marin specifically. She learned this from Petra, the head of the kitchen staff, who was the kind of person who knew everything about everyone 3 hours before it happened, and reported this information with the cheerful compassion of someone who genuinely wanted you to have time to prepare. Petra pressed a warm roll into Marin's hands across the kitchen counter and said, "They're asking questions about you." The Caldwell representatives spent an hour with Lord Steward this morning. "You should know." "What kind of questions?" Marin asked. "The kind where someone has a theory about a disruption and is looking to make it your fault," Petra said pleasantly. "The kind that ends with a reassignment to one of the border outposts, if you're not careful." She paused. "Or worse, if Lord Caldwell has his way about it." Marin ate the roll and thought about this. She thought about it with the same methodical care she applied to treaty discrepancies, laying each piece flat, examining it from all sides, as since noting where the logic failed and where it held. The Caldwells had a daughter whose bonding with the king had just publicly collapsed. They had standing and pride and a political alliance that was now in question. They needed someone to blame, and she had been standing in the doorway, and she was a third-tier record keeper with no family connections and no political weight, which made her the most convenient possible explanation for everything that had gone wrong. She was, in short, in considerable trouble. She went to the archive, and she worked with extra care that day, cataloging 2 months' worth of backlogged territorial correspondence and updating the lineage registry through 3 new family branches, making herself as useful and documented and irreplaceable as possible. She kept her chin tucked. She kept her feet quiet on the marble. The thread in her chest pulled steadily toward the upper floors of the palace where Calum Ashvane moved through his day. And she kept her hand away from her sternum because touching it made it worse, more vivid, more specific. She could almost tell, from the quality of the pull, whether he was in motion or seated, whether he was comfortable or under strain. This was new information she did not know what to do with. On the second day, she received a formal summons. It was not from the king. It was from Lord Steward Halvern, who administered palace staff, and it read with the precise bureaucratic courtesy That means you are in serious difficulty, but no one wants to put the word serious anywhere near official documentation. It requested her presence in the administrative offices that afternoon. It used the word clarification 4 times. She went because she was not the kind of person who ran from official summons, and because she had already run once this week, and she thought she had used up her allocation. Halvern's office smelled of old wood and the particular bureaucratic anxiety of a man caught between 2 more powerful forces than himself. He was a thin wolf with sharp eyes and a permanent slight wince, as though the world was just slightly louder than he preferred. He had been kind to Marin across 3 years in the absent, distracted way of administrators who appreciate efficient workers and do not want to examine them too closely. He was not kind today. He was careful, which was different. He explained that the Caldwell family had raised concerns. He explained that a disruption to the bonding ceremony was a serious matter under pack law, not a criminal matter, necessarily, but a matter of investigation. He explained that witnesses in the gallery had reported seeing Marin in the doorway at the moment of the disruption, and that several people with considerable standing in the court had suggested, not formally, not yet, that someone of uncertain bond status, someone with a known history of damaged mate magic, might represent a source of interference for such a sensitive ritual. He said all of this with the expression of a man who did not fully believe it and also did not feel empowered to say so. I did nothing deliberate, Marin said. I know, he said, and looked briefly and acutely uncomfortable. I believe that. But the Caldwells are pressing for what? She said. Flat, controlled. For your removal from the palace, he said. Quietly, before the investigation formally opens. He paused. And I have been advised, from a source I cannot name, that Lord Caldwell may not be satisfied with relocation. He considers the disruption to be. He considers you to be a direct obstacle to his daughter's interests. He did not say what Lord Caldwell intended to do about an obstacle. He did not need to. Marin folded her hands in her lap. Steadily, she noted with distant professional pride, and thought about what to say. She thought about the borderland seam where she had been born. She thought about the locked box under her cot with the healer's reports inside. She thought about the thread that was even now across the administrative building, pulling warm and steady and insistent toward the person who apparently was, against every reasonable expectation, the other end of her. She said, I understand. I'll need until morning to organize the archive records before any formal handover. Halvern looked at her with something that might have been relief, or might have been guilt, or might have been both, and he said, I'm sorry, Marin. You've been excellent. She went back to the archive. She sat at the work table. She did not organize records. She thought with terrible clarity about what she was going to do. She was going to leave. This was the rational decision. This was the self-protective decision. She had survived 3 years in the palace by being invisible and useful and contained, and she had failed to be invisible at the exact worst possible moment. And now the rational thing was to retreat to a place where the Caldwells could not reach her and rebuild the careful architecture of her ordinary life. She could find a village archive somewhere. She could find work. She was good at her work. She could take the locked box with the healer's reports, and she could find a new healer in a new territory, and they would tell her the same things all the others had told her, and she would nod, and she would be fine. She pressed her hand to her sternum. The thread pulled, warm, steady, and so precisely, specifically his, that she wondered, sitting there in the cold archive with her hand over her heart, how she had ever called it anything else, how she had ever filed it away and annotated it, and told herself it was merely professional admiration for a man who happened to have a quality on stillness that she had found, privately, beautiful. The stillness of someone carrying a great deal more than they allowed to show. She thought about the moment he had said, I know who you are. She thought about the 60-year treaty discrepancy. She had not known he noticed. She thought about his expression in the archive, the one she had never seen on him before except in fragments. The open one, the unguarded one, the one that looked like the warmer version of him, had pressed through the glass at last. She thought, this cannot end well. She thought, I am going to go upstairs anyway. She went upstairs. Getting to the king's private study was, theoretically, impossible for a third-tier record keeper. In practice, she had spent 3 years learning every corridor in the palace, every servant's passage and back gallery and connecting route, because that was simply how she moved through the world. Thoroughly, precisely, with a thorough map in her head of everywhere she was and was not supposed to go. She went through the archive corridor and the north gallery passage and the secondary staff stair that connected, via a linen closet on the 4th floor, to the hallway outside the king's study. She had used this route exactly once before, to deliver an urgent treaty document at night, and she had spoken to no one and seen no one and returned the same way. She stood outside his study door. She raised her hand and she knocked, because she was not a person who snuck into rooms. She was a person who arrived and announced herself even when she would rather not. The door opened almost immediately, as though he had been expecting her. He was not in the bonding robes anymore. He was in dark working clothes, simple and unadorned, and he had clearly been at his desk for hours. There was ink at his wrist, and his hair was less arranged than it had been in the moon hall. And he looked, Marin thought, considerably more human, considerably more like the figure she had sometimes glimpsed through the window of this very study, the warmer one pressing against the glass. I was told you were leaving, he said. I was told that also, she said. I came to tell you directly that I had nothing to do with the disruption to your ceremony. I didn't intend. I wasn't trying to. She stopped, organized herself. The magic moved toward me without my direction or consent. I would have prevented it if I could. I want you to have that on record from me directly. He was watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Not the closed, controlled one and not the unguarded one, but something between. Something that was carefully and deliberately deciding to let her see more than he usually showed. That is not why I was told you were leaving, he said. I was told you were being pressured to leave by people who do not have the authority to remove palace staff. She was quiet for a moment. Halvern seemed to feel they had a pathway. Halvern is mistaken, he said, with a flatness that was not unkind but that reminded her briefly and fully of exactly what he was. Come inside. She came inside. She had been inside this study once before in the dark, at speed with her eyes on the document and then the door. It was different now. It was large and warm, with books along 2 walls, and a fireplace that had been burning long enough to become comfortable, and a desk covered in the territorial correspondence she had been cross-referencing downstairs for 3 years. Through the window, the city below the palace was lit in the early evening, ordinary and unaware. He said, "Tell me about the curse." She looked at her hands. She said, "It isn't a proper curse. My bond thread is structurally compromised. I was born on the seam between territories where the old wolf magic runs shallow and fractured, and something in my bonding capacity was affected. Every healer I've seen has confirmed it. I can feel the pull of a fated bond, but I can't seal one. The magic passes through me without completing." He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He had moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the city the way she had seen him look out at it before, through the glass. He said, "I was 14 when my first bonding assessment was done. The elder told my father that I had an unusual bond signature, that my mate thread was extremely specific, that it would recognize one person with great exactness and would not respond to another. He said this as though it were a fine quality." He paused. "By the time I was 25 and had not found a fated mate, my council decided it was a liability. By 30, they had arranged Lady Seraphine, because the territories needed stability, and a king without a bonded mate is a political vulnerability and practical considerations exist. He turned from the window. I went along with it because I had decided that what the elder called specificity was simply another word for deficiency, that I was, in the relevant sense, broken. She felt the thread between them pull very still, the way things go still before something important. "And then tonight," she said. "And then tonight," he agreed. They looked at each other across the study. The fire was warm. The city was below them, ordinary and unaware. And in the moon hall, the bonding scroll still sat unsealed in its velvet case. And somewhere in the palace, Lord Caldwell was making plans about her. And somewhere under her cot was a locked box with 11 different healers' reports, all saying the same careful, wrong thing. She said, "The healers weren't lying. My bond thread is genuinely compromised. I've felt it my whole life, the way it doesn't hold, the way the pull passes through without completing. What happened tonight I can't explain." "I can't either," he said, "but I know what I felt, and I know what the old magic does and doesn't do." He crossed the room toward her, unhurried, certain, the same way the magic had moved across the moon hall. He stopped at a distance that was not quite appropriate, and she didn't step back. "I think," he said, "that two broken things occasionally fit together in a way that neither broken thing could have predicted." She thought about frayed thread and extreme specificity. She thought about the way water finds a crack and fills it exactly. She thought about the click in her spine. She said, "Lord Caldwell is going to make this very difficult." "Yes," he said, with the complete and unsentimental agreement of a man who was currently in the middle of a political problem he had created by declining to complete his own bonding ceremony in front of his entire court. "He is, I should leave," she said. "If I leave quietly, the Caldwells get what they want, and the court gets its explanation, and you can reschedule the ceremony and—" "I will not reschedule the ceremony," he said. It was not a declaration in the enormous sense yet. It was simply stated fact, the way he might report a territorial boundary or a historical date. And it landed in the room with the same quiet density of something true. The bond did not rise for Seraphine. It cannot be forced. "I tried. I spent 6 months in correct courtship, and the magic was entirely indifferent." He looked at her steadily. It was not indifferent tonight. She knew. She pressed her hand to her sternum. For a moment, the reflex she had been carrying for 3 years and felt the thread warm and whole and pulling toward him from a distance of approximately 4 feet. She said, "I need to think." He said, "Of course." He moved back to his desk with a deliberateness that felt like courtesy, giving her space, giving her room to breathe and assess. "I should tell you that I have already spoken to Lord Stewart Halvern and made clear that no member of the Palace Archive staff is to be relocated or pressured at the Caldwell family's suggestion. You are not going anywhere you don't choose to go." He sat at the desk and picked up the nearest document as though he intended to work, and then stopped and looked at her again. "But I also want to be clear that I am not asking anything of you. Whatever the bond is or isn't, whatever it can or can't seal, that is separate from what I am asking, which is only that you be safe." She looked at him sitting at his desk in his ink-stained working clothes in the warm study above the ordinary city. And she thought that she had spent 3 years filing away the way she felt in proximity to him, cross-referencing it, annotating it, sealing it in a locked box under her other careful assessments of herself. She thought that the stone in her chest that was now light had been there since long before the moon hall. She thought that she had been wrong about several things, possibly foundationally wrong, and that a person who catalogued errors in 60-year-old documents probably owed it to themselves to examine their own records with the same care. She said, "I'll stay tonight. Let me think in the morning." He nodded. He looked at the document in his hand. She looked at the fire. The thread between them was very warm and very quiet. The way things are when they have settled somewhere they were always going. She did not leave in the morning. This was partly because of the thread and partly because of the locked box, which she retrieved from under her cot at first light, and sat with in the archive for an hour, reading 11 healers' reports with the methodical attention she usually gave to territorial correspondence. She had read them many times. She had always stopped at the same sentence in each one. Your bond thread cannot seal, and taken it as conclusion, as closed finding, as definition. She read them again now, all the way through, and noticed for the first time that in 8 out of 11 reports, the healer had also written something further. The thread appears to terminate without an endpoint, as though the other end has not yet been located. Extremely high specificity in fated bonds can, in rare cases, create mutual amplification. A frayed thread reaching a matched thread can reinforce both. I cannot account for the thread's behavior under conditions of direct contact with the exact fated individual. She sat with these sentences for a long time. She thought about 11 healers who had given her an accurate partial diagnosis, and from which she had drawn a total conclusion. She thought about 60-year-old treaties with errors that had gone unexamined, because everyone had simply filed the previous assessment and moved on. She thought about Calum saying the assessment was incomplete. She went back upstairs, not through the linen closet this time, through the main corridor, at a pace that felt less like sneaking and more like going somewhere on purpose, which was what it was. She walked past 3 courtiers who looked at her with the sharp curiosity of people who had been thinking about her for several days. And she kept her chin level and her feet quiet, and she arrived at the study door and knocked. He opened it. He looked like he had been working since before dawn, which she suspected was his ordinary condition. He looked at her with the between expression, careful, deliberate openness, and he said, "You're still here." "I read the reports again," she said. "All the way through. There are caveats in 8 of them that I had never examined closely." She paused. "I think I owe you. I think I owed myself a more thorough analysis." Something happened to his expression. Not dramatic. She had observed that he rarely did dramatic, but some small, precise shift, as though a door he had been holding very carefully had been allowed to open by another inch. He said, "Come in. There's something I need to show you." What he needed to show her was a document from the palace's own archive, which was, she noted, somewhat mortifying, given that she had been cataloging the archive for 3 years and had not found it. It was in the restricted historical collection, which she technically had access to, but had not fully surveyed. A collection of old territorial magic records from 3 centuries ago, and the relevant passage, which he had apparently spent the previous night finding, described a phenomenon called correspondent damage. It was rare. It occurred in fated pairs where both individuals had bond threads affected by unusual conditions. Extreme specificity on one side, fractured seam magic on the other. And the result was that neither thread could function independently. But together, the 2 damaged threads formed a complete bond of unusual strength. The old magic, the document said, occasionally worked in this way, as though it understood that the pieces it needed were already formed but required their proper counterpart to become functional. A vessel with a crack and a vessel with a crack in the same shape will seal against each other perfectly. She read this passage 3 times. She was aware that she was standing very close to him. Close enough that the thread was not pulling so much as simply present, vivid and warm as sunlight. She said, "This is from the restricted collection." "Yes," he said, "I should have surveyed it." "You had no reason to look for it," he said. "I did. I've been looking for it, or something like it, since 2 nights ago." He paused. "Since before that, if I'm honest." She looked up. He was closer than she'd realized, and the between expression had shifted entirely to the unguarded one, and she thought about the warmer version of him pressing against the glass and choosing, always, to stay there, and she thought about what it meant that he had spent the last 2 days in the restricted archive looking for evidence that what had happened between them was real and possible, and had a precedent. She said, "It still might not work. The document describes a possibility, not a certainty." "I know," he said. I'm not asking for certainty. She thought about what he was asking for. She thought about 3 years of careful invisibility and a thread that had been pulling toward this specific person since long before she had admitted it to herself. She thought about the locked box, which she had carried from posting to posting across 2 territories before arriving here, as though she had known she would eventually need to reconsider everything it contained. She said, "I want to try." He looked at her the way the old magic had moved, slow, certain, without concern for what anyone else in any adjacent room might be preparing. He said, "Then we should probably discuss what happens when the Caldwells find out." The Caldwells found out the following morning. They found out because the court was a sealed system through which information traveled at the speed of self-interest, and someone in the household staff had seen Marin in the king's study 2 days running, and this information had reached the Caldwell family's representative by breakfast, and Lord Caldwell himself by noon, and the council chamber by mid-afternoon. Marin was in the archive when Petra appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone delivering news that they had hoped to delay until at least evening. "Lord Caldwell has requested an emergency council session," Petra said. "It's been granted, this evening before the second bell." She paused. "He's filed a formal disruption claim, against you specifically. He's calling you a saboteur." Marin set down the document she had been reviewing. She felt the thread pull, not in the warm, constant way, but in the urgent way, the way it had moved across the moon hall. She thought it was probably a reflection of what Calum was feeling at this moment in whatever room he was in, which was presumably some version of cold, controlled fury. She said, "What grounds?" "He says a wolf of compromise bond status in close proximity to a bonding ceremony constitutes interference under pack law. He's citing 3 historical precedents. I don't know which ones." He also says, Petra stopped. "Tell me," Marin said. "He says that if you're permitted to remain in proximity to the king, you constitute a permanent threat to any future bonding attempt, and that the appropriate remedy under old pack law is not relocation, but—" She stopped again. "Severing," she said, "of your bond thread, magically, permanently." The archive was very quiet. "There's a procedure for that," Marin said. Her voice was steady. She was distantly impressed with it. "Apparently. From before its old law, I don't think anyone's used it in a century. But it's on the books, and Lord Caldwell has a council of mages who say it's possible, and—" "Marin, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Petra pressed her hands together. "You should go to him right now." Before the session, she went. Not through the linen closet. Not through the archive corridor. Through the main hall, past the courtiers, who were now looking at her with the particular attention of people who have been discussing your situation for days and are very interested to observe you in it. She walked with her chin level and her feet quiet, and she did not run because she was done ruzzing. She knocked on the study door. He opened it before her hand had dropped. "I know," he said. "I've already sent word to postpone the session. They've denied the postponement." He had the controlled expression back, but under it something was running hot. She could feel it through the thread, a kind of concentrated stillness that was actually the opposite of still. He said, "Severance is not legal under current pack law. The old provision was struck when the territories unified. Caldwell is citing a precedent that no longer holds." "Is he wrong?" she said. "Legally." He was quiet for one beat. "The Council's mages may argue it survived the unification in the territorial subcode. It's a complex question." Another beat. "Which is why I am going to this session, and I am ending this before it reaches argument," she said. "I should be there." He looked at her. The hot, controlled expression did not change, but something underneath it did. Some additional layer of careful, deliberate decision, the same quality she had seen when he had taken a step back in the study to give her room. He said, It will be public. It will be in front of the whole council and half the court and the Caldwells and if I say what I intend to say, it becomes irrevocable." He paused. "I want to be sure you understand what I'm intending to say." She understood. She thought about the old document. Correspondent damage. Pieces finding their proper counterpart. The vessel with the crack and the vessel with the same crack, sealing together. She thought about the thread in her sternum, whole and bright in his. She thought about 3 years of careful invisibility and decided that 3 years was long enough. Say it, she said. The council chamber was the largest formal room in the palace, larger even than the moon hall, with tiered seating along 3 walls and a central dais, where the king stood when he addressed the council. It was full. Marin was not sure if this was because word had spread so quickly, or because Calum had made the session open. But every tiered seat was occupied, and courtiers stood along the walls, and the Caldwell family occupied the first-tier seats directly below the dais. Lord Caldwell at the center with the expression of a man who has prepared a very thorough argument and is looking forward to delivering it. He began immediately. He was a large man with a practitioner's voice, precisely calibrated to fill a room without appearing to strain. He presented his historical precedents with the smooth confidence of someone who had briefed his mages carefully. He explained the old provision in the territorial subcode. He explained the concept of bond disruption and the legal framework for addressing it. He was, Marin acknowledged from her position at the back of the chamber, very good at this. He did not address her directly. He addressed the council, and he described a third-tier archive worker of uncertain bond status, who had placed herself in unauthorized proximity to a sacred ritual and whose presence had caused immeasurable damage to the Caldwell family's relationship with the crown. He did not say her name. He said her designation, staff, Tier 3, archive, with the specific inflection of a man reminding everyone present of exactly how much or little her designation entitled her to. She stood at the back of the chamber, and she held her hand away from her sternum, and she listened and she breathed. Calum stood at the center of the dais, and he listened also. His expression was the closed, controlled one. Absolute, opaque, the version she had catalogued from a distance for 3 years. He let Lord Caldwell speak for the full length of his prepared remarks. He let the council mages add their legal commentary. He let the room hear all of it, complete, uninterrupted. Then he said, "Are you finished?" The room went quiet with the specific silence of people recognizing a shift in register. Lord Caldwell said, "I have presented the legal basis." "You have," Calum said. "And you are wrong about the subcode. The old provision did not survive the territorial unification. My legal counsel has verified this, as has the territorial registry. And if your mages disagree, they are welcome to file a formal challenge through the Greyhaven judicial process, which will take approximately 18 months and will confirm the same finding." He looked at Lord Caldwell for a moment, without any expression at all, and Marin felt through the thread what she had been right about earlier. Not fury, but something much colder and more complete than fury. "This is not a legal matter," he said. "It is a political maneuver dressed in historical law, and I want that to be clear to everyone in this room." He turned then, away from Lord Caldwell, away from the council, and he looked to the back of the chamber, where Morin was standing. She felt the entire room turn with him, felt the weight of the court's attention shift toward her, and she held herself still and level and did not tuck her chin. He said, 3 nights ago, the bonding magic of this pack, magic that is older than the palace, older than the territories, older than any law in this room, recognized its fated pairing. Not the pairing my council arranged, and not the pairing any of you expected, and not the pairing I would have chosen if I were selecting based on convenience, or bloodline, or political weight. It recognized her. He said her name then, not her designation, not her tier, her name, Marin, in the same tone he had used when he said, "I know who you are," the tone of a man who had been paying attention to something specific for a long time. A wolf who has spent 3 years serving this palace with more precision and more integrity than most people in this room have brought to their service in decades. A wolf who has a flaw in her bond thread, that corresponds exactly to a flaw in mine, and which the old magic has apparently decided is not a flaw at all but a match. A wolf who corrected a 60-year error in the Greyhaven Treaty in her second month and asked for nothing for it. The chamber was entirely silent. Lord Caldwell's expression had gone through several versions of itself and settled on something complicated and tight. She is not a disruption, Calum said. She is not a saboteur. She is not an obstacle to any future bonding ceremony, because there will not be a future bonding ceremony for me with anyone else. She is my fated mate, and if the old magic is in any doubt about that, I am prepared to demonstrate it here, in front of all of you right now. He paused. How could I not claim the person the oldest magic in this territory chose for me? How could I not recognize what I have been looking for and tell you all exactly what I found? He walked off the dais. He walked the length of the chamber. He walked to the back of the room where Marin was standing, and every pair of eyes in the chamber followed him, and she stood still and level, with her chin up and her ink-stained hands at her sides, and he stopped in front of her. He said quietly, so that only she could hear, "I told you it would be irrevocable." She said, just as quietly, "I told you to say it." He extended his hand to her, palm up, the same gesture she had watched from the gallery doorway 3 nights ago, directed then at someone else, completing nothing. She looked at his hand and then at his face. The unguarded expression, the warmer version of him that was no longer pressing against glass, but simply here in the open air of a full council chamber, unconcerned with the several hundred witnesses. She placed her hand in his, the magic rose. She felt it before she saw it. Felt it in the thread, which had been warm and steady for 3 days, which now became something else entirely, something that had no analogy she could reach for, except possibly the difference between a candle and the sun that the candle was trying to describe. It rose from their joined hands, and it was not delicate or tentative. It was the old magic doing what the old magic did, which recognize and seal and light between two people with the same uncomplicated certainty it had always had. The same certainty it had been trying to express 3 nights ago when it had crossed the entire moon hall to find the right doorway. There was a sound in the chamber. She did not know if it was gasps or murmuring or the echo of the magic itself off the stone walls. She was not in that moment attending carefully to the room. She was attending to the thread in her sternum, which had been her most careful, most guarded secret for 2 years and 8 months, which was no longer cracked or frayed, or passing through her, without completing, which was sealed and bright and impossibly whole, connected to the person, on the other end of it, with a completeness that she had been told her whole life she would never feel. She thought about the healer who had said your bond thread appears to terminate without an endpoint, as though the other end has not yet been located. She thought about located. Calum's hand tightened on hers, and she looked at him, and the expression on his face was the fully open one, not a fragment, not a glimpse through glass. All of it the warmth he had been holding in reserve for so long it had probably calcified, and he had clearly been in the process of melting it out by degrees since the moment he had walked into the lowest archive and said, "I know who you are." He looked at her the way the old magic moved. Slow, certain, entire, he said, so low that it was only hers. "There it is." "There it is," she said. The magic did not fade. It settled. The way the thread had settled in the archive 3 nights ago, the way things settle when they have found where they were always going. It was warm and complete and anchored, and around them the chamber was very loud now. The council and the courtiers and the Caldwell family and the mages all reacting to what they had witnessed. And somewhere in the noise, Lord Caldwell was saying something with force and considerable displeasure, and none of it touched the sealed circle of the bond at all. She was aware of Calum turning toward the room, her hand still in his, and of him saying several things to the council in a calm and final tone that she was confident were very relevant and well-reasoned and entirely irrevocable. She was aware of Sorcha, the elder officiant, emerging from the tiered seats with an expression of intense professional interest and saying that in 40 years she had never seen the magic behave in precisely this manner, but that its intent was unmistakable and its sealing was complete and that she would enter the record accordingly. She was aware of the bonding scroll being located and of Sorcha requesting the ceremonial cloth, and of the whole apparatus of the formal bonding beginning to assemble itself around her in this room that had not been prepared for it, with no ivory dresses or silver hair or velvet cases, with the chamber in uproar and the blood moon 3 days gone, and Lord Caldwell protesting audibly from the first tier. She was aware through all of this of Calum keeping her hand in his, not ceremonially, not as a demonstration, just holding her hand steadily while the world around them made a great deal of noise about something that had already, for both of them, been decided. She thought about all the things she had believed about herself and filed in a locked box. She thought about correspondent damage and matched cracks, and the way the old document had described 2 broken threads forming a bond of unusual strength. She thought that unusual strength was perhaps an understatement. The thread between them was nothing like a frayed or cracked thing. It was the opposite. It was more anchored than anything she had felt in her body before, as though the specificity that the elder had called Calum's deficiency and the fracture that 11 healers had called her curse had been, each of them, precisely the shape of the other. She thought that a person who catalogued errors in documents probably should have examined their own foundational records sooner. She thought that she had arrived at the correct finding, eventually, and that this was what mattered in thorough archival work. She looked at the room, the uproar, and the Caldwells and the silver-haired Sorcha threading the binding cloth between their joined hands and the council mages leaning together in urgent conference about a subcode argument they were going to lose. And she thought that she had been very good at being invisible for a very long time, and that she was apparently done with it, and that this was fine, more than fine. She examined the feeling with the methodical attention she gave to everything she wished to understand, and she found that it was something she did not have a precise word for. The feeling of a locked box opened. The feeling of 3 years of careful filing suddenly reclassified under the correct heading. The feeling of a thread that had always been reaching for something finally, reaching it and holding, and holding, and holding. Sorcha spoke the old words again. They were the same words Marin had heard from the gallery doorway 3 nights ago. And this time she was not in a doorway, she was in the center of the room with her hand in his, and the magic between them so present and alive that she could feel it humming in the cloth as Sorcha wound it. She looked at Calum, and he was looking at her with the full unguarded warmth, and she thought, I noticed the Greyhaven Treaty. I corrected it. I asked for nothing. And somehow, in the way of old magic and correspondent damage and cracks that fit together, he had noticed that and had remembered it across 3 years, and had come down to the archive at midnight in his bonding robes when he should have been anywhere else. She thought that this was perhaps the most thorough finding of her career. Sorcha tied the last knot. The old magic rose to its full height between them, not the tentative flicker of the moon hall 3 nights ago, but the full, complete, confirmed light of a properly sealed fated bond. And it illuminated the chamber with a warmth that had nothing to do with the torches along the walls, and the chamber went quiet in the absolute way of people witnessing something that the old stories described, but that very few living wolves had seen, which was a fated pairing completed against every expectation, in an uproar, in ink-stained hands, in a room that had not been prepared for it. In the quiet, Calum said, not quietly, not for her alone, but for the room and the council and the record, and for Lord Caldwell in the first tier with his displaced argument, this is my mate. This is the only ceremony I will be completing. If anyone in this chamber has a formal objection, they are welcome to take it to the Greyhaven judicial process, which I have just been told will take approximately 18 months. He looked at the room with complete, unsentimental calm. It will take me considerably less time than that to ensure the palace is a comfortable place for my mate to continue her work in whatever capacity she chooses. He looked at Marin then, with the private warmth, and said quietly, "Whatever you choose." She thought about the archive below, with its backlogged territorial correspondence and its restricted historical collection and its 60-year-old errors waiting to be found. She thought about a wolf who cataloged errors, and the king who had apparently been waiting for that specific quality in a person for a very long time without knowing what he was waiting for. She thought about what it might be to do her work without her chin tucked, without her feet quiet, without the constant effort of being nothing more than a fixture of the background. To simply be thorough and precise and ink-stained and present in whatever room she happened to be in. "I'll keep the archive," she said. "It needs a great deal of work. The restricted historical collection alone will take months." She paused. "There may be additional precedents in there that the Caldwell mages haven't found yet. I would hate for them to discover something useful before I do." He looked at her for a moment with the fully open warmth and something else, something that was almost laughter, some quality she had glimpsed once or twice through the study window, in unguarded moments, the quality she had filed under unknown, unclassifiable, do not examine. She was going to examine it extensively. She was going to have a great deal of time. "I'd hate that too," he said. Around them, the chamber began to exhale. The uproar resumed, but differently. Not in the sharp, disrupted way of 3 nights ago in the Moon Hall, not in the political way of the council session, but in the gradual, warm, slightly bewildered way of a court that had just witnessed something it would be discussing for decades and had not yet decided how it felt about it, but was beginning, from the edges, to feel something that looked like awe. Sorcha was already writing in her ceremonial record with the expression of someone who plans to describe this evening in detail for the rest of their professional life. Several courtiers in the upper tiers were visibly moved, which Marin found interesting as a data point about the audience for unexpected love stories. Lord Caldwell left the chamber with the Caldwell representative without formal remark, which was either dignity or retreat, and was probably both. Marin watched him go with the same level attention she gave to everything, and noted that his legal argument had been both thorough and entirely irrelevant, and that this was an instructive lesson about the limits of correct preparation. The binding cloth was still wound between her hand and Calem's. It would be formally unwound later by Sorcha in the completion ceremony. For now it was warm and present and real, and through it the thread between them burned bright and anchored in a way she was going to have to develop entirely new internal vocabulary to describe, because none of her existing files covered it. She thought, "I was wrong about the most important thing." She thought, "I corrected the error eventually." She thought, "This is what the archive is for." The old magic settled into them both like warmth into stone, patient, deep, going nowhere. And for the first time in the life of a woman who had been born on the seam between territories and told that the fracture went all the way through, Marin felt the thing she had always been reaching for land in her chest and stay, complete and certain and entirely, irrevocably hers, and she held on to it with both hands and did not let go.